The real reason Japan surrendered. It wasn't just the atomic bombs. August 6, 1945. An atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima. 70,000 people die instantly. The world has never seen destruction on this scale. August 9, 1945. A second atomic bomb destroys Nagasaki. Another 40,000 dead immediately. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender. World War II is over. The story we've been told is simple. The atomic bombs were so devastating, so unprecedented, that Japan had no choice but to surrender. The bombs ended the war. They saved millions of lives by making an invasion of Japan unnecessary. It's one of the most well-known narratives of World War II. There's just one problem. It's not the whole story. What if I told you that Japan's military leaders weren't particularly impressed by the atomic bombs? That they'd already endured months of firebombing that killed more people than both atomic bombs combined? That the thing that actually terrified them happened on the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, but had nothing to do with atomic weapons? Welcome to Echoes of W2. Today we're going to challenge one of the most fundamental narratives about how World War II ended. We're going to examine what actually made Japan surrender, and you'll discover that the atomic bombs, while important, were only part of a much more complex story. The real reason Japan surrendered had as much to do with Stalin as with Truman, with the Soviet Union's invasion of Manchuria as with American atomic weapons, with internal Japanese politics as with military defeat. Your history teacher probably gave you the simple version. Today, you're getting the complicated truth. Let's start with what Japan's situation actually was in summer 1945. Because understanding why they surrendered requires understanding what they were facing. By August 1945, Japan had already lost the war. This wasn't a matter of opinion. This was objective military reality. Japan's navy was destroyed. Its air force was decimated. Its merchant fleet was at the bottom of the ocean. The home islands were under blockade. Japan couldn't import food, oil, or raw materials. The economy was collapsing. American forces controlled the Pacific. They'd taken Iwo Jima and Okinawa, getting close enough to launch constant bombing raids on Japanese cities. Every major Japanese city had been hit. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. Firebombing had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and left millions homeless. The bombing of Tokyo on March 9 to 10, 1945, killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night. This was more than either atomic bomb would kill, and it was done with conventional incendiary bombs. So by August 1945, Japanese cities burning wasn't new. Massive civilian casualties weren't new. Japan had been enduring this for months. Yet Japan hadn't surrendered. Why? The answer lies in Japanese military and political culture. Japan's government was dominated by military leaders, particularly the army. These men had spent their entire careers in a culture that glorified death before surrender. The concept of surrender was shameful, dishonorable, unacceptable. Japan's strategy in summer 1945 wasn't to win the war. They knew they couldn't win. Their strategy was to make an American invasion of Japan so costly that America would agree to a negotiated peace rather than demand unconditional surrender. This strategy was called Ketsu-Go, the decisive battle for the homeland. Japan was preparing to mobilize its entire population. Men, women, children. Everyone would fight. Civilians were being trained with bamboo spears. Kamikaze tactics would be used on a massive scale. The plan was to kill so many Americans during an invasion that the U.S. would accept a compromise peace. The goal wasn't victory. It was to preserve something from defeat. Specifically, to preserve the emperor and possibly avoid Allied occupation. Japanese leaders looked at Okinawa as proof their strategy could work. The Battle of Okinawa had cost America over 12,000 dead and 38,000 wounded. It was one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific War. And Okinawa was just one island. If one island could kill 12,000 Americans, Japanese leaders reasoned, what could the entire Japanese home islands do? with millions of soldiers and civilians willing to fight to the death. The casualties could be staggering. American military planners knew this too. Estimates for invading Japan ranged from 200,000 to over 1 million American casualties. Nobody knew the exact number, but everyone knew it would be horrific. So both sides understood the situation. Japan couldn't win, but could make victory extremely costly for America. America could win, but at a terrible price. This created a stalemate. Japan wouldn't surrender unconditionally. America wouldn't accept anything less than unconditional surrender. Into this stalemate came two events in August 1945 that changed everything. And here's what most people don't understand. These two events happened on the same day, August 9, 1945. Most history books focus on one, the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. But there was another event that day that terrified Japan's leaders even more. The Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. Let's talk about what the Soviet invasion actually meant, because this is the part of the story that gets left out of most textbooks. Japan and the Soviet Union had maintained an uneasy peace throughout most of World War II. They'd signed a neutrality pact in 1941, while Japan fought America and Britain, and while the Soviet Union fought Germany. The two avoided fighting each other. This suited both sides. The Soviets couldn't fight a two-front war. Japan couldn't either. So they maintained the neutrality pact, even as they fought other enemies. For Japan, this neutrality pact was crucial to their endgame strategy. Japanese leaders hoped the Soviet Union might mediate a negotiated peace with America. The Soviets weren't Japan's friends, but they might be willing to broker a deal that avoided Japan's complete destruction. Japanese diplomats had been making overtures to Moscow for months, asking if the Soviets would be willing to help negotiate peace terms. The Soviets gave vague, non-committal responses. They didn't say yes, but they didn't say no either. What Japan didn't know was that Stalin had already agreed to enter the war against Japan. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin promised Roosevelt and Churchill that the Soviet Union would attack Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. 3 months from that date was August 8. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. On August 9, at 1 minute past midnight, Soviet forces invaded Manchuria. The scale of the invasion was massive. The Soviets deployed over 1.5 million soldiers, 5,000 tanks, 5,000 aircraft. It was one of the largest military operations of the entire war, and it was devastatingly effective. Japanese forces in Manchuria, called the Kwantung Army, had once been Japan's most elite force, but by 1945, the best units had been withdrawn to defend the home islands. What remained in Manchuria was undermanned, under-equipped, and unprepared for a Soviet assault of this scale. The Soviets smashed through Japanese defenses. They advanced hundreds of miles in the first week. Japanese positions that were supposed to hold 4 months collapsed in days. The Kwantung Army was being annihilated, but the military defeat in Manchuria, as bad as it was, wasn't the real problem. Japan had been losing battles for years. They'd lost the Philippines. They'd lost Okinawa. They'd lost most of the Pacific. The Soviet invasion was terrifying for different reasons. Strategic and political reasons that went beyond the military situation. First, the Soviet invasion destroyed Japan's hope for a negotiated peace. If the Soviets were now at war with Japan, they couldn't mediate between Japan and America. The last diplomatic option was gone. Japan now faced unconditional surrender or total destruction. There was no third option anymore. Second, the Soviet invasion opened a second front that Japan absolutely could not defend. Japan had concentrated its remaining forces to defend the home islands from American invasion, but the Soviets were attacking from the west, through Manchuria and Korea. Japan didn't have forces to defend multiple fronts simultaneously. Third, and this is crucial, the Soviet Union's entry into the war meant that Japan now faced the possibility of Soviet occupation. Not just American occupation, Soviet occupation. Japanese leaders knew what Soviet occupation would mean. They'd seen what happened in Eastern Europe. The Soviets didn't just defeat countries. They installed communist governments. They executed or imprisoned political and military leaders. They fundamentally transformed occupied societies. For Japan's military and political elite, this was their nightmare scenario. An American occupation might be humiliating, but there was a chance they could preserve something. The emperor, the basic political structure, Japanese culture and identity. A Soviet occupation would mean revolution. The emperor would be overthrown. The military leadership would be executed. Japan's entire social and political order would be destroyed and rebuilt according to communist ideology. This terrified Japan's leaders more than American bombs, more than atomic weapons. The existential threat wasn't just military defeat, it was the complete annihilation of everything they valued about Japan. Fourth, the Soviet invasion was progressing so quickly that it threatened to reach Japan itself before America could. Soviet forces were racing through Manchuria and into Korea. If they maintained that pace, they might invade Hokkaido, Japan's northern island, before American forces could land. If the Soviets reached Japan first, they'd have a claim to occupy at least part of the country. Japan would be split like Germany or Korea, part under American control, part under Soviet control. For Japanese leaders, this was unacceptable. If Japan had to surrender, it was better to surrender to America alone than to both America and the Soviet Union. This is the context that's missing from most accounts of Japan's surrender. Yes, the atomic bombs were devastating. Yes, they were unprecedented. But Japanese leaders were evaluating them within this broader strategic picture. And in that picture, the Soviet invasion was potentially more threatening than the atomic bombs. Now let's talk about what happened inside Japan's government between August 6 and August 15. Because the decision to surrender wasn't simple or unanimous. It was the result of intense, agonizing debates among Japanese leaders. Japan's government in 1945 was complex. There was the emperor, Hirohito, who was theoretically absolute ruler, but in practice had limited direct power. There was the civilian government, led by Prime Minister Suzuki. And there was the military, specifically the army and navy leadership, who had enormous influence over policy. These groups had to agree on surrender, and they didn't agree on much. After Hiroshima was bombed on August 6, Japan's Supreme Council for the direction of the war, the 6 most powerful leaders in Japan, met to discuss the situation. The meeting was divided. Foreign Minister Togo argued for immediate surrender. The war was lost. Further fighting was pointless. Japan should accept the Potsdam Declaration, which demanded unconditional surrender, but suggested the emperor might be preserved. But the military leaders, particularly War Minister Anami and the Army Chief of Staff, refused. They argued that Japan could still fight, that the Ketsu-Go strategy could work, that surrender was dishonorable and unnecessary. The debate went in circles. No consensus was reached. Then came August 9th. 2 things happened that day. Nagasaki was bombed with a second atomic weapon, and the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. The Supreme Council met again. Foreign Minister Togo now had more ammunition for his argument. 2 atomic bombs. Soviet invasion. The situation had fundamentally changed, but the military leaders still resisted. War Minister Anami made arguments that sound shocking to modern ears. He said the atomic bombs, while terrible, didn't fundamentally change Japan's military situation. Japan had already endured massive bombing. Cities had been destroyed before. The atomic bomb was just a more efficient way of doing what conventional bombing had been doing for months. He wasn't wrong. Exactly. From a purely military perspective, the atomic bombs were devastating but not qualitatively different from the Tokyo firebombing. Both killed tens of thousands. Both destroyed cities. Japan's military capability had already been crippled by conventional bombing. The atomic bombs didn't make Japan more defeated than it already was. But the Soviet invasion was different. That changed the strategic picture. that eliminated the possibility of negotiated peace, that created the threat of Soviet occupation. The Supreme Council remained deadlocked. 3 members favored surrender, 3 opposed. With no consensus, the decision went to Emperor Hirohito. This was extraordinary. The emperor rarely intervened directly in government decisions. His role was usually ceremonial, symbolic. But in this crisis, with the government deadlocked, Hirohito was asked to break the tie. On the night of August 9th, Hirohito met with the Supreme Council. They presented both positions. Then they asked for his decision. Hirohito decided Japan would surrender. He gave several reasons. The atomic bombs demonstrated that further fighting was futile. The Soviet invasion eliminated hope for negotiated peace. And most importantly, continuing the war would lead to the complete annihilation of the Japanese people. This last point is crucial. Hirohito wasn't primarily concerned with military defeat. Japan was already militarily defeated. He was concerned with national survival. If the war continued, if the Americans invaded and the Soviets advanced, Japan might cease to exist as a nation. But even with the emperor's decision, the debate wasn't over. The military leaders, particularly the army, still resisted. Some argued the emperor had been misled. Some claimed surrender was unnecessary. Some suggested Japan should continue fighting regardless of the emperor's wishes. Over the next several days, there were multiple meetings, debates, and increasingly desperate arguments. War Minister Anami found himself in an impossible position. He personally believed surrender was wrong, but he also believed in absolute loyalty to the emperor. How could he oppose a decision the emperor had made? Some junior military officers wanted to launch a coup, to prevent the surrender announcement, to continue the war. They approached senior officers trying to gain support. Some senior officers were sympathetic but ultimately refused to support a coup against the emperor's decision. On August 14th, Anami committed suicide. His death was a form of apology and protest. He couldn't support surrender, but he wouldn't oppose the emperor. Suicide was his way of escaping the contradiction. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito recorded a radio address announcing Japan's surrender. It was the first time most Japanese people had ever heard the emperor's voice. The address was carefully worded. It didn't use the word surrender. It said Japan would endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. By accepting the Potsdam Declaration, the address cited the atomic bombs as one reason for surrender. But it also mentioned a new and most cruel bomb and the entry of the Soviet Union into the war. Both factors were presented as reasons for the decision. So what actually made Japan surrender? Was it the atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion, the emperor's decision, internal Japanese politics? The honest answer is all of these factors together. The atomic bombs were important. They demonstrated American technological superiority and willingness to use devastating weapons. They killed tens of thousands instantly and showed that America could destroy Japanese cities, one by one, without risking American lives. But the atomic bombs alone probably wouldn't have forced surrender. Japan had endured similar destruction from conventional bombing. The Tokyo firebombing killed more people than Hiroshima. Japanese leaders had shown they were willing to accept enormous civilian casualties. What the atomic bombs did was psychological. They showed that America didn't need to invade. America could destroy Japan from a distance, repeatedly, without suffering casualties. This undermined the Ketsu-Go strategy. If America didn't invade, then Japan couldn't inflict enough casualties to force a negotiated peace. The Soviet invasion was equally important, possibly more so. It eliminated Japan's hope for a negotiated peace. It opened a second front Japan couldn't defend. It created the threat of Soviet occupation, which terrified Japanese leaders more than American occupation. The Soviet invasion also added time pressure. Japanese leaders realized they needed to surrender to America quickly, before the Soviets could advance far enough to claim a role in occupying Japan. Better to surrender to America alone than to both powers. The emperor's decision was crucial. Without Hirohito's intervention, the deadlock in Japan's government might have continued. the military might have continued resisting surrender. The war might have dragged on for weeks or months longer. But Hirohito's decision was itself influenced by the atomic bombs and Soviet invasion. He cited both as reasons. He saw that further resistance would lead to complete destruction, that Japan faced not just military defeat, but potential national extinction. The internal Japanese debates mattered too. The military leadership's willingness to fight despite impossible odds. The eventual acceptance that the emperor's word was final. The decision by most military leaders not to support a coup. All of these internal political factors influenced when and how surrender happened. So the complete answer is complex. Japan surrendered because the atomic bombs demonstrated that America could destroy Japan without invading, undermining Japan's strategy of making invasion too costly. The Soviet invasion eliminated hope for negotiated peace and created the threat of Soviet occupation. The combination of these factors convinced Emperor Hirohito that further resistance would lead to national extinction. The emperor's decision, combined with the loyalty most military leaders still felt toward him, prevented a coup and allowed surrender to proceed. It wasn't any single factor. It was the convergence of multiple pressures at the same moment in August 1945. But here's why the simplified narrative, the idea that the atomic bombs alone ended the war, became dominant. It served everyone's interests. For America, it justified the use of atomic weapons. If the bombs ended the war and saved millions of lives by preventing an invasion, then their use was morally defensible. This narrative became important during the Cold War, when America needed to justify possessing and potentially using nuclear weapons. For Japan, focusing on the atomic bombs allowed them to present themselves as victims of unprecedented weapons, rather than as an aggressor nation that had lost a war of conquest. The narrative of Japan as victim of atomic bombing became central to post-war Japanese identity. For the Soviet Union, initially, they emphasized their role in Japan's surrender. Soviet historians argued the Red Army's invasion was the decisive factor. But as the Cold War developed, the West largely ignored the Soviet contribution. So the simplified narrative, atomic bombs equals surrender, became the dominant story in Western education. It's easier to teach, it fits into a clear moral framework, and it satisfied political needs during the Cold War. But it's not the complete truth. The complete truth is messier, more complicated, and involves multiple factors converging at once. Understanding why this matters requires us to think about how we remember history, and what narratives we accept. The simplified atomic bomb narrative has shaped how we think about nuclear weapons. It created the idea that atomic bombs are so devastating that they make traditional warfare obsolete, that nuclear weapons are ultimate weapons that decide wars instantly. This isn't necessarily true. Japan's experience suggests that even atomic weapons, devastating as they are, don't automatically force surrender. Japan's leaders were willing to endure atomic bombing. What they couldn't endure was the combination of atomic bombing, Soviet invasion, and the elimination of all hope for negotiated peace. This has implications for how we think about nuclear deterrence today. If we believe atomic bombs alone forced Japan's surrender, we might overestimate the coercive power of nuclear weapons. The reality is more complex. Nuclear weapons are incredibly destructive, but political and strategic factors still matter enormously. Understanding the Soviet role in Japan's surrender also matters for how we understand World War II. The standard Western narrative focuses heavily on American and British contributions. The Soviet role, particularly in the Pacific War, gets minimized or ignored. But Soviet entry into the war against Japan was strategically crucial. It changed the calculation for Japanese leaders. It accelerated the surrender. Millions of Soviet soldiers fought in Manchuria, and tens of thousands died in a campaign that lasted only weeks, but was instrumental in ending the war. Ignoring this contribution distorts our understanding of World War II, and feeds into Cold War narratives that minimized Soviet contributions to Allied victory. Finally, understanding the complexity of Japan's surrender reminds us that historical decisions are rarely Simple. Japan didn't surrender because of one factor. It surrendered because multiple pressures converged at once, creating a situation where surrender became the least bad option. This is true of most major historical events. They're not caused by single factors or simple explanations. They're the result of multiple forces, competing interests, and complex decisions made by people facing impossible choices. Your history teacher probably told you the atomic bombs ended World War II. That's not wrong, exactly. But it's incomplete. The atomic bombs were part of why Japan surrendered. The Soviet invasion was another part. The emperor's decision was another part. Internal Japanese politics was another part. All of these factors mattered. All of these pieces fit together to create the moment on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced that Japan would endure the unendurable and surrender. This is echoes of W2. The atomic bombs didn't end World War II by themselves. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the internal debates in Tokyo, the emperor's intervention, and the convergence of multiple strategic pressures all played crucial roles. The simple story is that the bombs forced surrender. The true story is that Japan surrendered when continuing to fight became strategically impossible and politically untenable, due to factors that included atomic weapons but went far beyond them. Now you know. Now you know that the narrative you learned in school was incomplete, that history is more complicated than simple cause and effect, that the end of World War II wasn't just about bombs, but about diplomacy, strategy, politics, and the desperate calculations of leaders facing impossible choices. Now you know the real reason Japan surrendered.